Perfect. Hi, everyone. It's always a pleasure to come up here, and especially when we have such newsworthy things to talk about today, like higher education and water. And I guess everyone's here to talk about the election. But prior to delving into all of that great information, I will want to talk a little bit about the statewide survey more generally. The mission of the statewide survey is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions. And our goal is to inform and improve state policy making, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. We've provided a voice to all Californians on important state policy debates since 1998, and we've interviewed over 320,000 Californians in more than 150 surveys. This particular survey series, as well as the briefing today, is funded by, as Kelly mentioned, the James Irvine Foundation. We look at election and national issues in the front half of our survey report, including preferences in the presidential and U.S. Senate primaries, as well as approval ratings of federal elected officials and some issues surrounding the role of government. We also look at state and fiscal issues, which include approval ratings and overall mood of the state, as well as opinions on the state and local tax system and state spending and revenues. Our survey took place from March 6th to 15th. The date of the 15th is relevant, as we'll talk later about the presidential election. That was Super Tuesday 2.0. And our interviewing took place half on landline and half on cell. We interviewed about 1,700 California adults, and that margin of error is 3.6%. We interviewed just over 1,000 likely voters, and that margin of error is 4.4%. It's important to note that for the just over 500 Democratic primary likely voters, the margin of error is 6.2%. While for the 300 and change Republican primary likely voters, that margin of error is 7.3%. So as we go through some of these findings, particularly on the likely voters and the subgroups of likely voters, that's important to consider. So today we find that there are stark partisan differences in satisfaction with candidate choices in the presidential election, with 2 and 3 Democrats being satisfied, half of Republicans are satisfied, while just 1 and 3 independents are satisfied. As you can see, satisfaction has changed slightly for Democrats, while we've kind of seen a slight decrease in satisfaction among independent likely voters. Lower income likely voters are more likely, more affluent likely voters to be satisfied, and men are more satisfied than women. About 6 in 10 Latino likely voters are satisfied, while about half of whites are not satisfied with their choices in the presidential election. Now moving to the Democratic primary, it's important to note that the Democratic primary is semi-closed primary that allows independents to participate if they choose to do so. And among Democratic primary likely voters, Hillary Clinton has the support of 48% of likely voters, and Bernie Sanders has the support of 41%. Following trends that we've seen elsewhere in states that have already voted and in polling nationwide, about 6 in 10 likely voters under the age of 45 support Senator Sanders, while about 6 in 10 of likely voters age 45 and older support Secretary Clinton. Also, as we've seen elsewhere, Latino likely voters prefer Clinton to Sanders by a wide margin, 23-point margin today, while whites are more divided. And so these are things that we've seen elsewhere. Sanders has the support of nearly 6 in 10 likely voters who describe themselves as very liberal, while Clinton has the support of half of those who describe themselves as middle of the road. So there's, both this kind of racial, ethnic, income, and age differences, as well as ideological differences. On the Republican side, the primary is closed, and thus only Republicans can participate. As I mentioned, interviews for this survey completed on March 15th, and that was the same evening that Marco Rubio bowed out of the race. Given the timing of kind of where our survey was going to fall in between Super Tuesday 1.0 and Super Tuesday 2.0, we made the decision early on to ask Republican voters who their second choice would be in case we would have people drop out of the race and we could reallocate those votes. So with Rubio included, Donald Trump has twice the support of his nearest rival. However, once the supporters of Marco Rubio are allocated, we see that Ted Cruz receives the largest benefit, and the gap narrows to an 11-point lead for Donald Trump. And so with and without Marco Rubio in the race, Donald Trump has the support of 38%. And what we found is that Trump leads all candidates across age, education, income, and gender groups. Notably, among women, Trump leads Ted Cruz by 25 points. That's one of the wider divides that we find. So shifting from the presidential race to the Senate primary to replace or to fill Barbara Boxer's open seat, we find that fewer than half of likely voters are satisfied with their choices of candidates. Once again, we see that there is this partisan divide and ideological divide, with 2 in 3 Democrats and liberals being satisfied with their choices compared to 1 in 3 Republicans and conservatives being satisfied. About 4 in 10 independents and moderates are satisfied with their choices of candidates. Latinos are far more likely than whites to be satisfied in this race. And looking at the preferences, as the race is just taking shape, it's important to note that under California's top 2 primary system, this race includes all candidates regardless of parties and is open to all registered voters. At this stage in the campaign, a plurality of likely voters are actually unsure of who they would vote for, 31%, while Democrats Kamala Harris and Loretta Sanchez would be the top 2 candidates in advance to the general election. However, it's important to note that 4 in 10 Republicans and just under 4 in 10 independents are unsure of who they would vote for at this time. Fewer than 1 in 10 likely voters support Republicans Tom Del Beccaro or Duff Sondheim. And among Democrats, Harris has the support of 38% compared to 30% for Sanchez. Among Republicans, Del Beccaro receives the most support, while among independents, Harris receives the most support. Latino likely voters prefer Sanchez over Harris, 36 to 22, so by about a 14-point margin, while whites are twice as likely to prefer Kamala Harris. So turning to approval of federal elected officials, President Obama continues to have the approval of about 60% of Californians. This has been the case since about January of last year. His approval had hovered around 50% during the latter half of 2013 and all of 2014. There's a wide partisan divide, as you might expect, on approval of President Obama, with about 8 in 10 Democrats approving of his job performance and 8 in 10 Republicans disapproving. Independents are slightly more likely to approve than disapprove. This survey finds that majorities of men and women and majorities across age and education groups approve of President Obama. When it comes to Congress, just 1 in 4 approve of its job approval today, and fewer than 1 in 4 have approved of Congress since September 2009. So that's a long string of very low approval. Majorities of men and women and majorities across age, education, and, on this case, there was actually partisan agreement with Democrats, with just 1 in 5 Democrats and independents approving, while 1 in 10 Republicans approve of Congress. It's important to note that 1 in 5 Republicans approve of Democratic President Barack Obama, while 1 in 10 approve of the GOP-led Congress. So there's some dissatisfaction there with the status quo, which I think is in some ways bore out in the presidential primary there. Compared to adults nationwide in recent surveys, Californians in our survey are more approving of both President Obama and Congress. In the midst of a tumultuous election, 4 in 10 Californians say that things are heading in the right direction in the United States, while 56% say that things are going in the wrong direction. Californians are slightly more optimistic about the nation's economic conditions, with about half expecting good times here. In both cases, there's a partisan divide, with Democrats much more likely than independents and Republicans to be optimistic. We find that fewer than 3 in 10 whites, compared to half of Asians, African Americans, and Latinos, are optimistic about that the nation is headed in the right direction. And when we look at these two questions combined, we find that 3 in 10 Californians think that both things are headed in the right direction and expect good economic times. Fewer likely voters are optimistic on both of these items, and in fact, 4 in 10 likely voters both think that the nation is headed in the wrong direction and expect bad economic times. So once again, these findings kind of paint a picture of how people are feeling about the nation when they go to vote. Given this discussion within the presidential primaries, we wanted to ask a few questions about income inequality. As they have in the past, Californians and likely voters think that the gap between rich and poor in America is growing. There's bipartisan agreement on this, and as well as we find that majorities across regions and demographic groups feel that the gap between the rich and poor in America is widening. So a lot of agreement there, so let's remember that. However, when it comes to what the government should do about this gap, should government do more to address this gap, while we find that solid majorities of Californians and likely voters think the government should do more, there is a disagreement when it comes to across parties, with 8 in 10 Democrats and just over half of independents saying that government should do more, while just 1 in 3 Republicans hold this view. Beyond parties, however, we find that 2 in 3 across regions and majorities across demographic groups say that government should do more to address this gap. So once you go beyond the partisan divide, there's a lot of agreement on the role that government should play in addressing income inequality. So on this kind of basic question of what type of government you want, do you want a larger government with more services or a smaller government with fewer services? We find that just more than half of Californians would prefer having a larger government providing more services than a smaller government providing fewer services. Findings among adults nationwide are reversed, with majorities saying they prefer smaller government. So on this basic question sets California apart when it comes to how they view the size of government. Once again, as you might expect, Democrats and Republicans look at this basic question very differently and fall on different sides of this question. Solid majorities of Asians, African Americans, and Latinos prefer a larger government, while a majority of whites prefer a smaller government. And there is a wide divide on the question between younger and older Californians, as well as those at opposing ends of the income scale. So on this basic question, we see a lot of divisions across parties, age, and income groups about what should government be providing. So in the news recently, there's been a lot of debate about what role government should play in the regulation of business. And most Californians think that the regulation of business is necessary. Partisans are divided once again with strong majorities of Democrats saying that government regulation of business is necessary, and 2 in 3 Democrats saying that government regulation of business does more harm than good. Majorities of Californians across regions and demographic groups think that government regulation of business is necessary. And similar to the national comparison on the role of government, Californians in our survey are much more likely than those nationwide to say that regulation of business is necessary. So on these basic issues, we can really see this divide, whether we look at satisfaction with presidential candidates, Senate candidates, role of government, size of government. And so these are things that are really kind of on the basic question of government where we see these divides between the parties, at least at the national level. Shifting to the state level, we find that about half of Californians continue to approve of Governor Brown. This month marks the 15th straight survey dating back to April 2014 that a majority have voiced approval. Governor Brown has the approval of about 7 in 10 Democrats and 4 in 10 independents, compared to just 3 in 10 Republicans, which that 3 in 10 Republicans, keep in mind, is higher than the 2 in 10 who approve of Governor Obama or the 1 in 10 who approve of the GOP-led Congress. Approval of Governor Brown is highest in the San Francisco Bay Area among Latinos and those with children in their homes. We find that approval of the state legislature continues to hover around 40% or higher, as it has since April 2014. So in both cases, we've seen kind of an increase and then a stabilization when it comes to approval. And while 6 in 10 Democrats approve of the state legislature, it's interesting to note that more Republicans approve of Governor Brown than of the state legislature. Approval of the state legislature is higher among Latinos than other racial ethnic groups and is higher among younger, less educated, and lower income Californians. So about half of Californians say that the state is headed in the right direction and expect good economic times. At least 4 in 10 Californians have said that the state is headed in the right direction and expected good economic times since December 2012. Findings in recent months illustrate a marked recovery from the depths of the recession when fewer than 1 in 4 were optimistic from December 2008 through 2010. Democrats and independents are much more likely than Republicans to be optimistic on both these measures. And in fact, since January 2008, fewer than 4 in 10 Republicans have been optimistic on either measure. Optimism on both measures decline with rising age. And when we look at these two combined, we find that nearly 4 in 10 Californians say that both the state is headed in the right direction and expect good economic times, while 30% of Californians are pessimistic on both of these measures. As we've done in recent years, we wanted to take a look at the state and local tax system as people have taxes on their mind with tax day approaching in mid-February. Just as we have found in the past, the majority of Californians say that the state and local tax system is very or moderately fair. It's important to note that while the majority of that is on the moderately fair side, with just fewer than 1 in 10 saying that the system is very fair. 6 in 10 Democrats call the system very fair, call the system fair, while 4 in 10 Republicans and half of independents hold this view. Notably, just over half across income groups say that the tax system is fair. So regardless of what your household income is, you view that the tax system is fair in California. And while there's some agreement when it comes to the overall opinion of the tax system, when it comes to the personal tax burden, there's some disagreement there. We find that half of Californians think that they pay much more or somewhat more than they should in state and local taxes, while a plurality of 37% say they pay about the right amount. Democrats are more divided between thinking they pay much more than they should or thinking they pay the right amount. Nearly 8 in 10 Republicans think they pay more than they should, and just 1 in 5 Republicans say that they pay about the right amount. Half of African Americans think they pay much more than they should, while about 1 in 3 Latinos, Asians, and whites hold this view. And among those who think the tax system is fair, about half say they pay the right amount. Among those who think the tax system is not fair, about half think that they pay much more than they should. So as you might expect, there's a correlation there. So as we await the governor's May revise in a few months, the budget seems to be on more stable footing than it has been in recent years, and that's thanks to a improving economy and increasing tax revenue. And it appears that Californians are taking notice. For the second consecutive month and only the 4th time dating back to January 2006, fewer than half of Californians view the state budget situation as a big problem. Likely voters are more pessimistic about the budget situation, with 54% calling it a big problem. 7 in 10 Republicans, compared to just over half of independents, and 4 in 10 Democrats view the state budget situation as a problem. And in fact, at least 6 in 10 Republicans have viewed the state budget situation as a problem dating back to January 2008. And while nearly 2 in 3 residents in the Inland Empire think the budget situation is a big problem, just 38% of San Francisco Bay Area residents hold this view. So voters passed Proposition 30 in 2012, and there's been quite a bit of discussion about extending the taxes, which are now set to fully expire at the end of 2018. So how do Californians feel about this? Well, there have been numerous measures to extend these tax increases circulated, but now it seems like there's at least some settling in on one particular measure, and it recently reached 25% of the signatures needed to be placed on the ballot. This measure would extend for 12 years the tax increases on higher income earners to fund education and health care. Early on, some of the ballot measures also included the state tax, the state sales tax component, but it seems to be kind of settled in on this issue of just extending the higher income tax. About 6 in 10 Californians and likely voters favor extending these tax increases, but you guessed it, there's a partisan divide with most Democrats in favor and most Republicans opposed, while independents are divided. In past surveys, we've asked a similar question that would have extended the sales tax and the income tax, and support tended to be slightly lower when we asked about that question. In a separate question, we asked Californians, regardless of how you feel about the Prop 30 tax increases, do you favor or oppose California voters deciding this? And we found that 2 in 3 Californians and likely voters with bipartisan agreement favored the idea of these tax extensions being put to a vote. And so that's just symbolic of how Californians more generally feel about the initiative process and having a say on these issues. As we have in past surveys, we wanted to gauge the importance of a number of issues to California's future. Of the 4 issues we asked about, public higher education is seen as the most important, with 8 in 10 viewing the public higher education system as very important to California's future. Fewer, although still a solid majority, view spending more money on the maintenance of the state's roads, highways, and bridges is very important. About half of Californians view the governor's plan, proposed plan of building tunnels in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley as very important. And lastly, about 1 in 3 view the high-speed rail system as very important to California's future. Findings on the importance of higher education and high-speed rail are similar to recent years. However, the share viewing the maintenance of roads and bridges as very important has increased 9 points since last March. This, of course, comes as there's been a lot of discussion about transportation funding, and in fact, there's an ongoing special session on transportation right now. So with this focus on transportation, we wanted to ask a question that we last asked in January 2006, so a full decade ago. And we asked people what should have the highest priority on additional state funding regarding surface transportation projects. And the prioritization came down to about 1 in 3 saying public buses and transit, and 1 in 3 saying freeways and highways. About 1 in 4 said they would prioritize local roads and streets. Interesting regional findings emerged with half of San Francisco Bay Area residents prioritizing bus and transit, while half of Inland Empire residents prioritizing freeways and highways. About 4 in 10 residents in Los Angeles prioritize public transit, while about 4 in 10 of those in the Central Valley and Orange San Diego place more emphasis on freeways and highways. Public transit is more likely to be prioritized among Asians, younger Californians, those with a college degree, and those with household incomes under $40,000. So as much of California has seen increased seasonal rainfall, the perception among Californians that their regional water supply is a big problem has also decreased. This comes as about half of Californians say that people in their part of California are not doing enough to respond to the current drought. This finding that about half are not doing enough is similar to what we found in September, but it's dropped 17 points since last March, which was just as the conservation efforts and the push by the Water Resources Board was just beginning. So we've definitely seen a drop in the perception that their neighbors are doing enough to respond to the drought. Notably, across regions, residents in the Central Valley are the least likely to say that not enough is being done, while those in the Los Angeles region are the most likely. The perception that not enough is being done decreases sharply as age increases. So as I mentioned earlier, about 1 in 3 Californians view the high-speed rail system as very important. Comparatively, that was much lower than some of the other things we asked about. But how do Californians feel about building the high-speed rail system? About half of Californians are in favor of building the high-speed rail system, while about half of California likely voters are opposed to building the high-speed rail system. Findings among all adults and likely voters are similar to each time we've asked this question in March, dating back to 2012. There's a wide partisan divide here with 6 in 10 Democrats in favor, 7 in 10 Republicans opposed to building this. Support is higher among Latinos and Asians than among African Americans and whites. And when those who are opposed are asked how they would feel if it cost less, overall support actually increases to 66% among all adults and 59% among likely voters. And this kind of increase in support if it costs less is consistent with what we found in recent years. I guess with the kind of idea that the overall cost has dropped somewhat in I guess just a few weeks back. But they're now saying that it's going to take longer to complete, so perhaps next time we ask about it, we'll be asking what if it would take longer. So that's definitely an issue that people seem to be aware of. So shifting to public higher education, with 8 in 10 Californians viewing the public higher education system as very important, how do they feel about the necessity of a college education in today's work world? 6 in 10 Californians view a college degree as something that's needed in today's work world. Notably, there's a divide across racial and ethnic groups, with half of whites saying there are many other ways to succeed, while more than 2 in 3 across other racial ethnic groups say that a college education is necessary. About 6 in 10 Democrats view college as necessary, while 6 in 10 Republicans think there are many other ways to succeed without a college degree. And among those who view public higher education as very important, 63% say college education is necessary. Californians who say it is somewhat important are divided on the necessity of college. So in conclusion, there are these striking partisan differences in satisfaction with candidate choices in the presidential and Senate primaries. And this is really kind of a defining characteristic of those elections. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton currently garner the most support in presidential primaries. In the U.S. Senate race, Democrats Kamala Harris and Loretta Sanchez lead the top 2 primary. However, nearly 1 in 3 likely voters, including 4 in 10 Republicans, are undecided. Democrats and Republicans, as you've heard me say, I think once, are divided in many things, including the outlook for the nation and on both the appropriate role and the appropriate size of government. A majority of likely voters and Californians favor extending the Proposition 30 tax increases on these earnings of over $250,000 to fund education and health care. And most Californians view increased spending on the maintenance of roads and highways and bridges as very important to the state's future. So at this time, I will open it up to any questions you may have, but I just ask if you have a question to pause until the ladies with the mic can capture your question, since this is being broadcast. Right here on the right-hand side. Just one moment.
Thank you. That was wonderful. My name's Lee. I work in research. So, first of all, is this going to be all online?
Yes. So both the presentation, the full survey report, as well as I forgot to mention earlier, crosstabs among all adults and likely voters on all of these questions.
So it will be broken down not just like Democrat, Republican, but it might be broken down like areas and maybe the people's ages. Regions,
age, income. You name it, across the demographic breakdown.
We've done like SurveyMonkey, but what really bogs you down is when you get to people's comments at the bottom, and if you survey like 800 people and you got to read through all those comments, is that why you decided maybe to do just the verbal survey?
Well, I think in general it's been our habit to ask or to conduct all of our surveys via phone. We've seen an increase in cell phone interviewing to make sure that we capture this increase in cell phone only population. Online is something that we have explored somewhat, but at this point we feel that phone interviewing is the best method for us. Yes.
Hi, do you know what the recent percentage breakdowns are as to likely voters or registered voters who are Republican, Democrat, and Independent?
That's a good question. So with the most recent breakdown or release from the Secretary of State among registered voters, that number is 43% Democrats and 28% Republicans, with about 1 in 4 independents. And that's the fastest growing segment of the registered voter population. Regarding likely voters, I would encourage you to come back next week to hear this great panel discussion talking about California's exclusive electorate, where they'll look at the registered population versus those likely to vote versus those who are not registered to vote. So, yes.
Hi, for the California Senate race, is there any other data that you have about previous surveys or previous numbers on supporters of these in the election?
This is the first time that we've asked about the Senate race. This cycle, we will come back to this later in the spring before the June primary, most likely, and it's definitely something that we'll follow. But this is the first time we've asked about this year. Yes.
Thank you. I'm not sure this is the exact format, but my question is related to how the survey questions. These obviously are based off current events that are happening. Are there any plans to do any types of surveys where you ask Californians about how government operates in general, with ideas like should they improve their budgeting or how they perform in their accounting task or anything like that related to that, the process of how we operate, like government savings, money, things that nature?
We try to get into those issues when we can. Things like, I guess probably the most close to that would be the idea of like government trust, where we ask questions about how much of the time do you trust government, how much waste is there in government, how much, we'll ask other questions about kind of the governance, but given the kind of policy landscape and all the things that are popping up, we often focus on that. Yeah. Yes.
I'm wondering if from this survey or previous surveys, there was anything to clarify what people are so angry about with the current presidential candidates. I think there's been a lot of talk about sort of protest candidates. People are just really angry and unhappy with the status quo, and I'm just wondering about that.
I think we don't necessarily get into that specifically, but I think, with the kind of dissatisfaction with or the disapproval of Congress among Republicans, that kind of tells you that a little bit about the status quo. They also believe that the nation is headed in the wrong direction. They expect bad economic times. And so I think there's just a general sense of pessimism. We really haven't gotten a lot into what that pessimism may be regarding the current actions being taken. We just know that when we ask, say policy questions on immigration or other types of national issues, whether it be terrorism or other issues, that there's often a divide on the approaches that are either being taken or proposed. Yes. Well, I'll be up here for a few more moments if you have any further questions. And like I said, the crosstabs are online. I highly encourage you to kind of dig around and look at those online. And that's all at ppic.org. Thank you very much.